Pokrovsk has all but fallen despite a daring air assault mission which saw Ukrainian special forces leaping off a Blackhawk helicopter. Kyiv has continued its long-range strikes, hitting Russia's third largest power plant, and the Hollywood star Angelina Jolie has had first-hand experience of Ukraine's chronic manpower shortage after she was stopped at a military checkpoint and her driver was press gang taken to join the armed forces. Exactly the same thing happened to me. Kyiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're starting with Fortress Pokrovsk, the epicentre of the war, the town that Russia has been battling to capture for more than a year. We said it was in peril. Things have got worse. We've seen extraordinary footage of Ukrainian special forces air assaulting into the edge of the town, leaping off a Blackhawk helicopter and running forward, we understand, to prevent Russia choking Ukraine's supply lines. This was an operation by the GUR, Ukraine's military intelligence, and specifically their Timur Special Forces unit. Now, this was very unusual to see this kind of air assault in this war, principally because using helicopters so close to the front line is fraught with danger because of the risks of loitering drones, anti-air missiles, the opportunity to shoot helicopters down. Ukraine made great use of trying to shoot down Russian helicopters throughout the war. Nonetheless, they launched this operation. They sent at least 11 heavily armed soldiers. They were seen leaping off the helicopter, running forward into the town. But the other reporting is that hundreds of Russian soldiers are now inside Pokrovsk. They've surged in from the southern edge of the city, and open source maps, three different types I've been looking at: the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, UA control maps, and Deep State, all show significant gains by Russian forces, with some suggesting that a small number of Russian sabotage and reconnaissance troops have made it to the very northern edge of the town. Does that mean they control all of Pokrovsk? Absolutely not. But does it mean that there is a chaotic, messy and ferocious battle for what is left of this city, this town, taking place? Absolutely yes. I read one interesting account suggesting that the city had become like a vinaigrette where the forces of both sides were mixed up. What we've seen is predominantly these small numbers of infiltrating Russian forces seeping into the city in small groups. One of the reasons they've been able to make more rapid gains over the last week or 10 days is because of the weather. Rain and fog inhibits drone surveillance, which makes it easier for them to infiltrate. We now see them at the northern edge of the city, and that's significant because they've predominantly come in from the south. At the southern edge, footage emerged in the last 24 hours of a Russian vehicle. This was a pickup truck, a soft-skin pickup truck, operating on the southern edge, trying to clear barricades. But all of that taken together shows a significant and growing Russian presence in the city. It's unclear whether Ukraine is going to continue to fight street by street for the positions it may still hold. Ukrainian officials adamant they have not been surrounded. They appear to be falling back as the Russians advance to some extent. There are other Russian forces, though, in Mirnograd, nearby, an industrial town to the east of Pokrovsk. They are in a pocket, still controlled, a salient, still controlled by Ukraine, but the routes in and out are clearly threatened by Russia's advances. And whilst Russia may not have full control of the terrain, as these sabotage and reconnaissance groups move forward, they will inevitably, or they will attempt surely, to bring forward things like mortars and drones, and that will allow them to potentially further interdict the supply lines, Ukrainian supply lines. We've seen extraordinary footage, hard to verify, which appears to show the fields outside Pokrovsk glinting silver, lines of silver, and that's from all the fibre optic cables strewn across this landscape. And it's those fibre optic drones we know that both sides have been using, but particularly Russia has been using to try and choke Ukraine's supply lines. We saw that tactic really emerging in the summer after the same tactic was successfully used to choke and interdict Ukraine's supply lines running in and out of occupied Russian Kursk, where you remember Ukraine was forced to retreat. The city hasn't fallen totally. It may not fall totally. Ukraine may cling on to the last corners of it for weeks or months, as we saw in Bakhmut. But as ever, we're clear-eyed on frontline. The situation in Pokrovsk is dire. In the long-range battle, there are 4 Ukrainian strikes I want to talk about today. A spectacular raid on Donetsk airport. So that is occupied Donetsk, the old airport in Donetsk city, what was Ukrainian. Ukraine has hit what appears to be an ammunition and drone storage site. Significant secondary explosions there. Ukraine trumpeting that as a success. We've also seen a successful naval drone strike on the Savash oil platform in the Black Sea near Crimea, which Ukraine said was home to a Russian special forces operation with surveillance equipment and a missile launcher. Those oil platforms in the Black Sea have been strategic or important in the past, particularly for enabling or detecting each side's drone operations to try and defend the naval fleet. Russia's Black Sea fleet, you'll remember, forced to retreat to the east of the Black Sea. Nonetheless, that battle in the Black Sea continuing. Third strike is on Russia's third largest power plant. That is the Kostroma Grez plant, some 200 miles beyond Moscow, a reminder of the range that Ukraine is continuing to achieve. And that came a few nights after at least 5 substations in Russia were hit. So both sides have been targeting each other's energy infrastructure. We've also seen in the last 24 hours a Ukrainian strike on an oil depot in occupied Crimea. Has it been one way? Never is. Absolutely not. Russia continues to hammer Ukraine's power infrastructure and its logistics. Interestingly, though, over the last week or 10 days, intensity of Russian air bombardments has dropped slightly. I say that with some caution. The heaviest strike in the last week was 135 missiles and drones. There was a time in the war where we would have been talking about 100 missiles and drones in a night as huge. But over the course of this year, we've seen strikes where there have been many, many hundreds of missiles and drones. So this is a relative drop. It is still devastating. And the results of what we've seen in the last few days is that Ukraine's railway network, which has been a sort of remarkably resilient backbone for this country, has announced it suspended services on a line east of Kharkiv, travelling towards Slovyansk and on to Kramatorsk. And the line splits. It goes north in the sort of Liman direction to a place called Hodorok. This is significant because I think it shows that whilst we've talked about Russia deliberately interdicting road supply lines with drones, and we saw that in Pokrovsk, and we've seen that in and out of Kursk, here is an effort to choke sort of much larger, more arterial strategic supply lines further behind the front lines, but nonetheless also vital to supplying Kramatorsk. And as Pokrovsk has become more imperiled, I remember Pokrovsk sat on a major road and rail hub, which is seen as in many ways as the gateway to the Donbass. So that rail route from the north is likely to have become more important now that the roads and rail routes through Pokrovsk have become unusable. And the final thing today, we want to talk about Angelina Jolie's experience in Ukraine. The Hollywood superstar, star of Tomb Raider, was visiting Ukraine for the second time since the full-scale invasion. She'd visited Lviv in 2022. This time she was much closer to the front in Mykolaiv and Kherson regions in the south, and she visited underground hospitals and children's areas, schools, to try and draw attention to the horrors faced by civilians living under non-stop Russian bombardments. But while she was en route, travelling with a British charity called the Legacy of War Foundation, she was stopped at a Ukrainian military checkpoint. This is pretty normal in Ukraine. The soldiers demanded to see the papers of everyone in the convoy, and one of the drivers was found to have, well, according to Ukrainian officials, have been drafted and to have he was accused of dodging the draft. He was summarily taken away to a recruitment centre, and Ukraine's recruitment agency, the territorial recruitment centres, said that he is now preparing for mobilisation. Code for he has been press ganged and he's going to enter basic training. Exactly the same thing happened to me on my most recent visit to Ukraine. I didn't talk about it in the last update because it was still a sort of dynamic situation. I think we were still reeling slightly from the shock of it. It is extraordinarily shocking when you're traveling in a group, a tight-knit group who are relying on each other for your survival and your safety, to stop at a checkpoint. In this instance, our fixer, producer, translator, a Ukrainian journalist who we've worked with for many years, had exactly the same experience. Ukrainian soldiers demanded his papers, claimed that he should have been conscripted. We were forced. 3 armed men came into our car, demanded that we drive to a recruitment centre where he was effectively rubber-stamped healthy to fight. We were there for 8 hours. We tried to make appeals on his behalf. They were all unsuccessful. In fact, met, I think, with some fierce opposition in some senses from soldiers, understandably, one saying he should be proud to to serve in Ukraine's armed forces. And that is an understandable sentiment, but it is also interesting when, for example, people helping an international newspaper report on the conflict, people helping a Hollywood superstar draw attention to the conflict, are wrenched away from that work in order to fill gaps on the front line. I think it is a reflection of this chronic manpower shortage that Ukraine is facing. It raises some really bleak and really fundamental questions about Ukraine's ability to continue to prosecute this war of attrition. We've talked a lot about how it is a war of attrition and a war of resources and a war of will. And I've been amazed in my many trips to Ukraine by the determination of Ukrainian society to continue to endure what Russia inflicts upon them and to resist it. At the beginning of the war, there were more volunteers for the armed forces than the army could absorb, but that flow has dried up. There is a shortage of volunteers, and Kyiv and President Zelensky are facing very difficult political dilemmas about how to plug the gaps on the front line. And we know there are gaps, and we've seen the risk that those gaps create for Ukraine and the opportunities those gaps have created for Russia, particularly with, you remember, that spurt northwards that Russian forces managed to make to the east of Dobropilya, where they infiltrated past sparsely manned positions. As ever, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I shall do my best to answer as many as I can next time. We have 3 questions from last week's episode, which Philip Ingram presented, Colonel Philip Ingram, and thank you very much to him for doing that. Question number 1. If Putin were to die, who would be his likely successor? I think it's a really interesting question. It's the sort of question I think we could debate or analyse in a lot more depth than I can here today. But there are a number of names that regularly crop up. Were he to die, the protocol is that the Prime Minister, Mikhail Mishustin, would take over. Now, he has kept his own counsel, at least in public, on the war in Ukraine. He is sanctioned. In fact, all of the candidates I'm going to mention now have been sanctioned by the West. He would take over on sort of matter of protocol, just as the Vice President in America would take over if the US President were to be incapacitated or killed. He's also been picked by a survey that Radio Free Europe did, Radio Liberty did, of 40 Russian experts. They said whether Putin were to anoint a successor or whether Putin were to die unexpectedly, he would be their favoured candidate, the most likely candidate, not favoured, but the one they see as the most likely to come in. The Moscow mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, his name often crops up. He is 67, so slightly younger than Vladimir Putin. Another name we hear a lot is the ex-FSB chief, Nikolai Patrushev, knows President Putin from his time in the KGB, where they both served. He's 74 years old. He was Secretary of Russia's Security Council, but he was removed from that post last year, and suggestions that perhaps his star has dimmed. Of course, he's also even older than Vladimir Putin, so it might seem an unusual choice to pick a more sort of senior in age politician because of the longevity that he won't have. The risk with the concern, I think, with Putin leaving office, being assassinated, something we know many Ukrainians wish for and hope for, is somebody worse coming in. But those are 4 names. There are others in the frame. Worth having a look at that Radio Free Europe survey if you're interested to see a few more of them. Question number 2, cyber warfare. Are Ukraine's allies helping Ukraine with cyber warfare? Are cyber attacks working? The short answer is yes, we know they're working together. Britain's cyber security, the National Cyber Security Council, has talked about its support for Ukraine. Now that is primarily in a defensive role. Ukraine has to some extent talked about the fact that it's fighting what it describes as the first cyber world war. They don't discuss these attacks publicly, and certainly allies, as far as I'm aware, have not discussed openly any offensive capabilities that they are sharing, but we know that Ukraine and its allies are working together. And the final question is about Tomahawks and offensive missiles. Why are we talking about Tomahawk missiles? I'm asked when the JASSM, the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, would be almost as effective and can be launched from F-16s. It's a really good question. JASSM has a shorter range. The longest version of that missile, which is air-launched, has a range of about 1,000 kilometres compared to the Tomahawk's 2,500 kilometres. There was a report in the Times, the London Times, suggesting President Trump was considering giving these missiles the version he was contemplating. They have a shorter range of about 400 kilometres. So that's kind of in keeping with weapons that Ukraine, with donated weapons that Ukraine already has. It's a good question. Trump appears to be considering it. He said he was considering Tomahawks as well. At the moment, that consideration appears to be just that, just talk. And in the meantime, Ukraine takes matters into its own hand. It has developed its own long-range strike drones, its own long-range strike cruise missiles, the Flamingo, and to a large extent, those are the weapons that it continues to use to hit Russia deep inside Kremlin territory. As ever, thank you for watching. If you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll try to answer as many as I can next week.